and 5 compensation and merchandise.
Mr. Depp, at this time, how many other franchise films had you been a part of?
At that time, Alice in Wonderland. Boy. Alice in Wonderland. I'm so pathetic when it comes to knowing what movies I've done. I'm sorry. I just, I don't watch them. I feel better not watching them. I couldn't, I mean, what was the question again?
How many?
I
How
have
many
order
other
in the
fran-
court, or I will have you removed. Understood? Thank you.
How many other franchise films had you been a part of at the time of this contract?
There was a third. There was Pirates. There was, oh, sorry, with Warner Brothers, Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them, and then Crimes of Grindelwald.
And how does the compensation reflected in this contract compare to that, what you receive for the other franchises that you've been a part of?
Objection, Foundation.
He just established that he was a member of other franchise films at this point.
And he hasn't established a foundation that he knows how he was compensated for this.
I'll overrule the objection if you can answer.
I believe the compensation, obviously, all the pay and back end and all those things are negotiated by agents, lawyers, and this was comparatively, this is my salary on that film, and other salaries were of a similar status, I suppose.
If I could direct your attention to the 12th page of the document.
Yes. Who?
Is this your signature, Mr. Depp?
Yes, it is.
Okay. We can take this down, thank you. Mr. Depp, I recall that you testified that you don't know during a given period what movies you were working on. So my question is, who would know that?
Well, first and foremost, as my agent, or agents. I do recall a couple of the other films that I had made after. One was initially called Richard Says Goodbye, and that was, they changed the name to The Professor, and during all of the the nastiness over the past 6 years, that film went straight to pay-per-view. There was another film called Minamata that was produced. It was my company, Infinitum Nile. We had developed a film called Minamata about Eugene Smith, and the Minamata, the mercury poisoning of a very small fishing village in southern Japan. There was that one, and then there was a film called Waiting for the Barbarians with Mark Rylance and Robert Pattinson. Those were 3 films that I had done.
Mr. Depp, during your cross-examination, Mr. Rottenborn showed you a number of text messages between you and Paul Bettany. Do you remember that?
I do.
Could you please explain to the jury what your relationship with Mr. Bettany is?
Mr. Bettany and I had, we'd met while I was making a film called The Tourist in Venice, and we were, it was an instant connection. He's born and bred in the UK and has that English sort of dry, kind of obtuse, abstract sense of humor. And that was one of the things that we connected on, is taking, even if it was a difficult or unpleasant situation, we would, do our best to deal with it with humor, as opposed to just a constant complaint or whining or anything of that nature. We dealt with it with humor, albeit sometimes as these are private texts that have been, there was a lot of in context. It's important to know that none of it was ever intended to be real, and the language that's used, which yes, I am ashamed that that has to be spread on the world like peanut butter. For example, the text that is about burning Ms. Heard it's directly from Monty Python in the sketch about burning witches and then drowning the witches. This is a film that we'd all watched when we were 10, and it's just irreverent and abstract humor. That's what we were referring to in those texts.
The text message that you just referenced, other than Mr. Bettany, who else saw that text message at the time that it was sent?
No one, of course not.
Based on your own observations, how would you describe Mr. Bettany's relationship with Ms. Heard while you and Ms. Heard were together?
Abominable.
Why was that?
Ms. Heard despised Mr. Bettany mainly because we had become such close friends, and for her he was a threat, and would take me away from her with regard to if Paul Bettany was getting the attention from me. That was a showstopper. It would cause all kinds of unpleasantries, to the point of where when we were on the island with Mr. Bettany, his wife, and his 4 children, Ms. Heard and Mr. Bettany got into some debate over lunch, and I just remember that whenever Mr. Bettany tried to make a point, she would talk over him, and then it started to get quite rude. She got mean, and she got loud, and then his I believe it was his 18-year-old boy who was getting ready to go to a very bright, brilliant kid. He entered the conversation because this was something to do with what he'd studied in school, and he knew quite a lot about it, and he voiced his opinion. And Ms. Heard demeaned that young man to the point of where he burst into tears and walked away. And it was at that point that I had spoken to Ms. Heard and said, that's just unacceptable. That behavior is unacceptable. You have no right to demean that boy. You cannot always be right. You should try being wrong sometime because you might learn something. And then I asked her to, I thought it was best that she leave the island.
Could we please pull up Defendants Exhibit 245? And Mr. Depp, I believe this is another text message with Mr. Bettany that you were shown on your cross-examination. And directing your attention to the text message at the top of the page from May 30th, 2014. Do you recognize this text message you sent to Paul Bettany?
Yes, I do.
And could you please describe to the jury what you are conveying to Mr. Bettany in this message?
This again is, I suppose, an example of the way that I write and express myself. That is to say, you stretch your situation out to give him the understanding that you're drowning, essentially. So everything that I say here is, in fact, an impossibility for the human body. I would have been, well, I would have certainly at least had to be rushed to the hospital for a stomach pump. There's a line here that, if you don't mind, I say that when I say I'm done, I am admittedly too fucked in the head to spray my rage at the one I love, for little reason as well. I'm too old to be that guy, but pills are fine. The pills that were referenced were the pills that I that I was coming off of, and they were the only thing that could give me some semblance of the same numbing effect that I searched for as a child with my mother. And saying that I was too messed up in the head was, it's kind of like if you've been told since you were a child that everything you do is wrong, and that I shouldn't have even been alive, or whatever, joyous little treats that my then very sick, very ill mother brought to me. Ms. Heard was well aware of my past, my childhood, therefore was very adept at knowing exactly which buttons to push. So at this point, I mean, I felt like Well, I was that little boy again in my head, like, I guess I am incapable of doing anything right. I guess I will never be happy. I guess that this is who I am. I can't get along with this person. But it's confusion, you know. It's nothing that you can. It's nothing that anyone could sustain for any length of time. It's nothing that anyone should have to sustain for any length of time when you're being demeaned, berated, judged, and treated like a lesser animal. I'm treated as if I'm only surrounded by yes men, and that I'm a bad father, and that these things were endless. They were endless, and there was no call for them. It's hard to understand why someone that is supposed to love you could be that cruel. And there's also times where you just say, okay, I'm gonna try to not have I won't fall for the argument. I won't participate in the argument. Because I knew where it would go, into her circular pattern of psychological abuse.
Mr. Depp, what do you mean when you use the term blackout in this text message?
Blackout. Yes, because I'm talking about 1,000 Red Bulls and vodkas, 1,000 of them, 2 bottles of champagne, no food for days, half a bottle of whiskey. Those things, had that been all absolutely true, would have not only caused a blackout, but it would have caused a severe alcohol poisoning, overdose. I would have had to have gone immediately. If that were true, I would have had to have been taken to a hospital, or I'd just die. So, no, blackout is when someone gets so drunk on alcohol, essentially, on alcohol. But the pills that I had my addiction, that I was addicted to, the roxycodone, which are very, very powerful opiates. Two of those would knock me out. That is to say, so there's blackout, which is, you can be, a person could be wide awake and wreaking havoc, or having a giggle in a blackout and never remember it. But when you are, when you've taken the prescription medication, it knocks you out. You are certainly not, well, you're not in any condition to, first of all, swing at anyone. You are out. You go on what's called the nod, and then it takes you away into sleep. It's just very deep sleep. And I found that much more accepting than having to hear constant badgering and insults.
Mr. Depp, I'd like to show you Defendants Exhibit 153, which I believe Mr. Rottenborn also showed you last week.
Yes.
Do you remember seeing this during Mr. Rottenborn's examination of you last week?
Yeah, yes, I do.
Okay. Now, I'd like to show you the full text exchange, which is in Plaintiff's Exhibit 120. And since there's been a number of text messages drawn from this document, this would be Plaintiff's Exhibit 120C.
Which page would that be, or underscore?
This
Four?
would be 4 and
Okay.
5, Your Honor.
4 and 5, thank you.
Mr. Depp, do you recognize these text messages?
Yes, I do.
Your Honor, I'd move Plaintiff's 120C into evidence and ask that it be published to the jury.
All right, 120C in evidence, publish.
Mr. Depp, who are you communicating with in these text messages?
In fact, though it says Marino, these are texts between my ex, that is to say, the Vanessa Paradis, the mother of my children. And this is again, abstract humor that we're conveying back and forth to one another. This was all, it was a joke. It certainly wasn't about Miss Heard. We didn't speak of her much together.
Do you recall what you were talking about?
I don't recall who it was. I don't recall who it was, but it was someone who had, for some reason, I think it was, I think that the possibility is that 2013, it might have been, we had a nanny at one point, who in fact, we had, we found her, she was caught stealing, even from my, at the time, my, maybe 10, 11-year-old boy, Jack, who was bright enough, because he knew it, he was bright enough, he had a $5 bill that he wadded up and put on his desk in his bedroom, and when he came home from school...
Your Honor, I'm just going to object on relevance. The question was, who was this about?
Yeah, we can move on.
Okay.
Okay.
Mr. Depp, I'd also like to show you Defendants Exhibit 143, which I believe Mr. Rottenborn also showed you last week. Do you remember seeing this email exchange? You could scroll down as well, please. Thank you.
Oh, yes.
Who are you exchanging these emails with?
Stephen Duders, who was at the time was my assistant.
And what are you and Mr. Duders discussing here?
Gobbledygook, essentially. It was as I remember, it was a day of work, and there were times when I would send a text to Mr. Duders, because he's the worrisome type. I would send him a text in jest, of course, and to get a rise out of him, to get some reaction out of him. So, you know, I would tell him things like, you know, "Oh, I woke up and I'm bleeding profusely from the inside of my ear. Is that normal?" You know, it would be things like that. So this is exactly the same kind of thing. I think we were even referencing The Hangover, the film The Hangover, in part of this, about the Mike Tyson and sort of bizarre circus that I was telling him that I had in my room, and that there was blood everywhere. It was a joke to just sort of throw him off, worry him, and make. Ultimately, it was a joke, and we were laughing about it.
Mr. Depp, what if any portion of this email exchange is literally true?
We're all set to leave here at approximately 1:30 p.m. Hope you rested well.
Mr. Depp, I'd like to talk to you about some text messages that Mr. Rottenborn showed you where you refer to the monster, and this is in the context of, in conversations with, that don't include Ms. Heard. Do you remember seeing some of those communications?
Yes.
Okay. First, I'd like to show you Defendants Exhibit 427, please, which is a text message from you to Jerry Judge. How are you using the term monster in this context when you're communicating with Mr. Judge?
The monster could essentially, the monster could, it could be two separate things. The monster in her eyes was my,
Objection as to what the monster was in Ms. Heard's eyes, Your Honor.
All right. I'll sustain as to her eyes if you want to
Okay.
ask, rephrase.
the monster was defined by Ms. Heard as this out of control
Same objection,
thing.
Your Honor. What Ms. Heard's view of the monster was is not for this witness to say.
Mr. Depp, how do you know how Ms. Heard defined the word monster?
She said the words to me.
And what words did she say with respect to the term monster?
It was her go-to phrase, and it was the go-to phrase for me being, again, you know, as has been embellished and elaborated, the drug use or the drink or the whatever, but the monster was, for me, and again, you start to think about these things and you put it in your own head, in what the real context is. The monster was sobriety. The monster was trying to be sober because I was plagued by these requests to stop drinking. But the monster could also be if a conversation, if something starts as a conversation, which would quickly ramp up to quite an antagonizing argument, if I responded to her, if I took part in the verbal back and forth where people do in life end up saying obscenities, screaming obscenities at one another, or calling them names, or when it gets to that point, I mean, the monster was just for me, was just the guy who actually was dumb enough to continue to take part in arguments that would ultimately get nowhere. So that is one of the reasons why I would try to get away from Ms. Heard and not participate in her debates and the knowledge that she wanted to express to me, and circular and painful insults that were constant. It was rapid fire. So I stopped participating in those. I tried to walk away. I tried to go to another room, even to the point of locking myself in rooms so that she just could pound on the door and scream. That was clearly a I should have never fallen for that or taken the bait to allow myself to get into a conversation which led to an argument, which led to physical violence. It was not going to be good, so I just walk away, which drove her through the roof.
So, Mr. Depp, why would you use the term monster when communicating with people other than Ms. Heard?
Well, because I heard it all the time. I mean, it was, as I said, that was her go-to. The monster's here, the monster's back, monster. So I would refer to the monster again in terms of with Elton or with friends Patti Smith. The monster was like with Elton. I believe it was just the monster was I let the monster creep back in or something. That is sobriety. That's what I'm telling him is I have failed, and I've had a drink, or I've been drinking. But my drinking again was not to excess. I would never went into blackouts or anything of that nature. I was disappointed in myself for not staying there. Although when you are constantly in a position to be harassed by your beloved other, what else could I do? I wanted to be numb. I didn't want to hear that. I didn't want to feel that, especially from one who had professed such love for me, but gave me mostly hatred.
Your Honor, I'm about to switch subjects, so if this would be a good time for the lunch break.
All right, we started a little later, so I don't mind going a little further.
Okay.
If you want to do that, go ahead.
Mr. Depp, I'd like to show you Defendants Exhibit 161. I believe Mr. Rottenborn showed you this last week and again today.
Yes, yes,
Do you recognize these text messages as between you and Ms. Heard?
yes, I do. Yes, I do.
Why are you informing Ms. Heard that there's a book called Disco Bloodbath?
When I texted her, 2:30 in the afternoon, I was in a bookstore, a used bookstore, or a bookstore that had a lot of first editions and things like that, which was sort of a passion. And I saw a book called Disco Bloodbath, and I thought it was a funny title. I can't say that I was necessarily referencing anything other than I thought it was a funny title, Disco Bloodbath. It sounded like a sort of a bad slasher movie to me. So I said, just thought you should know that there exists a book titled Disco Bloodbath, that's all. And then she said, we need that book. And then she asked me, is it about last Friday night by any chance? And then my answer to her, how can you make me smile about such a hideous moment? The fact is, this is a light-hearted exchange that she's even saying, we need that book. Then she makes a reference to last Friday night, which